to Mental Health Momentum, a Silicon Slopes podcast. I'm Dr. David Morgan. I'm a licensed psychologist and the Director of Mental Health Awareness here at Silicon Slopes. And on this podcast, we talk about mental health issues in the workplace and beyond and look for solutions to that. I'd like to introduce you to my guest today, Dr. Holly Richardson. Holly, hello.
Hi, happy to be here.
Thank you. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Richardson. She's the editor of Utah Policy and a columnist for the Deseret News. A former Utah legislator, she holds a master's degree in professional communication and a PhD in political science, where she focused on public administration and nonprofit management and international relations. She studies burnout as well. We'll talk about that a little later in the podcast. In addition to politics, Dr. Richardson has written on peace building, conflict resolution, refugees, faith, family, and more. She and her husband, Greg, are the parents of a large and unique family. So I have to ask, with that last statement there, I need a little more data on that. Large and unique. Tell me what that means.
So my husband and I adopted 20 children, actually. I gave birth to 4.
20.
20.
Oh, my heavens.
And we're legal guardians for our granddaughter. So we have 25, but 19 are living. We've had 6 pass away.
Wow. What are the age ranges?
So our granddaughter is 10, and then we have a 10-year gap to the next youngest, and then we go all the way up to 37. So it's pretty big.
Wow. That's a lot easier just to say large and unique family then.
That's right. and they're all adults except for the granddaughter. They're all adults. So not raising them actively right now.
And so you were doing this while you were a legislator as well?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, it was during that time. So crazy stuff.
That's very, very busy. When were you in the legislature?
That was 2011. So it's already been quite a while.
Yeah. How long did you serve?
Just one single term, or one legislative session. Actually, I was a midterm vacancy replacement.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, it was a good experience. Learned a lot, and still involved in politics, but in a different way.
Yeah. Which do you prefer, being involved in politics the way you are now, or the way you were then?
From the outside, for sure.
Yeah. Why is that?
Less hate mail.
Oh, yeah.
So that was one of the things that surprised me the most is how free people feel to call you all kinds of names.
Yeah.
And, like, I learned new words while I was a legislator I didn't even know existed, and got some death threats, not serious ones I didn't think, because they were like mass emailed to the entire legislature. I'm like, okay, thank you very much for your kind input. The ones that were really eyebrow raising were the ones that would call me a bunch of names and then say, and now I want you to vote this way on this bill.
Right.
Like, well, that's not exactly how you win friends and influence people.
Not a page out of Dale Carnegie.
That's right.
And so regarding your education, when did you do that?
Yeah, so that's an interesting story. So when I was 19 years old, I actually graduated with my nursing degree. I was a registered nurse. That was an associate degree, and I took a 30-year break. So I married my husband, we started a family, and I was really focused largely on being a stay-at-home mom. So 30 years after I had left school, formal schooling, I went back to finish a bachelor's degree, and then I just kept going. So I got a bachelor's degree in 2016, a master's in 2018, a PhD in 2022 when I was 57. So it's, a very different, non-traditional journey, but one I'm super happy to have taken.
When I was getting my doctorate, I was considering that, taking a non-traditional route only because we were so poor. And we were so tired of being poor.
Right.
that I just thought, when I finished my master's, I thought, I'm just going to go out and get a job and do that. I had a good friend counsel me otherwise, which for me was the right way to do it, just to continue through. But I love the non-traditional path as well, if only because it just shows that there's so many ways to do this, right?
There are, and you come with a lot of life experience. So I may be a new PhD, but I have a lot of life experience, especially in the area where I research, as you mentioned, which is burnout and emotional labor, specifically looking at volunteers. But really, I had experience on my own. And I waited until my kids were either out of the house or they were at least in school before I went back myself.
Sure. Because it's not an easy path.
Yeah. It was really fun until I hit the PhD level. And then it was really a stretch for my brain. But I got there, and then the actual dissertation was quite fun.
The research is fun. If you enjoy research, dissertation is a blast. No question about it. So when I reached out to you to be a guest on the podcast, I asked her, I said, why the interest? And you said about mental health. So tell me about overall interest in mental health.
Yeah.
Why is this something that's interesting to you?
Well, for sure. I think it's an issue where we've at least, if we're not more aware, we're at least more open about struggles in mental health and about what that looks like, all up and down the chain, from kids who struggle with body image to adults who struggle with burnout to new moms with postpartum depression. I mean, I think really there's been an elevation of the willingness to talk about mental health
Yes.
struggles.
I often get the question of, because we're seeing an incident rate increase for certain, right?
Yeah.
In terms of mental health.
Yeah.
And people say, why is that happening? And I think part of it is that people are more willing to talk about it. So
Yeah,
it's
I think
becoming,
that's true.
people are sharing more. I also think that maybe some of the difficulties that we're facing now are just more emotional in general.
Mm-hmm.
And I think and I think even if we had like a crystal ball and we could see in the past of all the mental health issues that were happening in the 1980s or in the
Right.
1960s
Right.
Versus now, I think we'd still see,
Right.
notwithstanding just the willingness to talk about it, I think we'd still see an increase. With all the children that you adopted and that,
Yeah.
were there mental health struggles with them
Oh,
as
yeah.
well?
Yeah.
I would think.
Yeah, so we have a number of children who struggle with mental health issues, everything from bipolar disorder to kids who had reactive attachment disorder when they were younger, and now they still struggle as adults with that. I have a child whose biological mother drank heavily, and so he has fetal alcohol effect. He doesn't have
yeah.
a full syndrome, but that impacts his mental health and his ability to make decisions sometimes. So yeah, I mean, certainly we've struggled with the gamut. We've had a child with suicidal ideation. She has not completed suicide, but she's kind of been on the verge a couple of times, and trying to navigate that. And our granddaughter that's 10 has some really, really high anxiety for such a young child. And so that's been something else that we've had to deal with, and actually new and different from even raising the bulk of the rest of the kids, is her levels of anxiety is something new for me.
When I talk with younger people, like 20s and kind of a Gen Z and that, and when they struggle, I kind of say, welcome to the rest of your life. I mean, not that it's always going to be horrible, right? But it's
right.
just
Yeah.
the way it is,
Yeah.
right? We struggle with things, and
Yeah.
and as a parent,
Yeah.
here you are,
Yeah.
maybe having managed those issues yourself, but then you have children that have those issues,
Yeah.
and so it's always something. I love that we're just kind of keeping it in the forefront of conversation. So let's just be aware of what's happening. Let's talk about ways to deal with it and to fix it and to move forward, instead of viewing it as this huge thing that
Right.
cannot be moved past.
Right.
Because that's a fallacy.
Right.
Mental health is completely manageable.
Right.
It's just like
Right.
any other big issue, it's difficult.
Yeah. And it really ties into what I researched. So not only burnout, but together with burnout comes self-care, right?
Yeah.
And I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to talk about that. But there's some really important stuff that we know about how to become emotionally resilient and really emotionally healthy, even while we also maybe navigate mental health challenges.
Let's talk about burnout,
Great.
because I love that. So why did you, how did that interest start for you?
So I really am a qualitative researcher, which means I'm
Mm-hmm.
looking at personal experiences, and I had my own experiences with burnout, and they really started with the family. Right? I found I was burning out as a mom, and I had to go and find ways to keep myself emotionally grounded and resilient with all of the stressors of raising a very large, very unique family. And there's really not a lot of academic research on volunteers, and I really wasn't looking in academic research at the time. I was saying, how do I take care of myself? So as I went through parenting and found things that worked for me, there were things like journaling, and I used music. There were things like having a few really solid friends, those types of things. Those were all helpful to me. Practicing gratitude, another thing that was very helpful. So when I got into academia a little bit more, I was really interested. I had been taking humanitarian trips as a volunteer, and then I became a volunteer team lead, also taking people on trips. And the two paths started to go together. So the volunteer path and the academic path. And I was able to see that people were burning out as volunteers, trying to do good work, right?
Yeah.
And I started to wonder why that was, right? And when I started looking at academic literature, what I found largely was that burnout and emotional labor, which is the component that I also researched, but they really go together, and they're looked at generally in context of paid employment.
Right.
But there's also other a little bit of research, but I think some common sense tells us that burnout happens in other spaces as well.
Like in hobbies and stuff almost. Is that what
Even
you're
that,
talking about?
but
Yeah.
but things like parenting. So there's some
Okay.
there's some research on burnout and parents, but it really is looking specifically at parents of children with disabilities, which we also have. But there's also, like, it makes sense if you're an entrepreneur, for example, and starting your own business, you may have to put in a lot of hours at the beginning to get this off the ground and going, and burnout may happen. But the traditional advice for overcoming burnout, it really is situated in this paid employment, right? So
Right.
if you say, well, don't answer your phones on nights and weekends and take a break or take a sabbatical or change
Right.
supervisors, they
Take a
really don't
sabbatical from
apply.
parenting, right?
Right, exactly. See, there's
Right,
no off-ramp
exactly.
for
Yeah.
parenting, and there's no, if you took a sabbatical from your brand new company, it'd probably die off before
Right.
you get back, right? So some of the advice is really situated in the paid employment, but there has to be a way for people to care for themselves. Anyway, that's what I was looking at, is these volunteers who were taking these trips and wondering, first of all, were they impacted by burnout? And second of all, what were they doing to mitigate those effects? And what I found in my research was absolutely they're impacted by burnout. They know it, they feel it. It was pretty much 100% of the people within my study. And yet they really want to be involved in this humanitarian effort of giving back and providing service. And so they know that they have to take care of themselves. And so all of them were like, okay, these are things we know that work. And what I did in my research is separate surface self-care from deep self-care. So surface self-care is what we a lot of times think about, maybe Instagram self-care. Here's the perfect smoothie, and I'm going to do a Netflix binge, or I'm going to have a donut, right? So they may be temporarily satisfying, but they are not filling, right? They don't give us that deep emotional resilience that we need. So those are the things that we see that are the journaling and the mindfulness and meditation and sometimes spiritual practices and practice of gratitude. Those things can really help deepen that emotional resilience.
I'm assuming there is a correlation when the surface and deep self-care, that surface self-care probably takes less time and effort and deep self-care takes more time and effort.
For sure.
Is that accurate?
Yeah, for
Okay.
sure. Yeah. Just imagine, right? You can, you run down and get a smoothie or a donut, and it doesn't take a lot of time or effort. It just is not that filling.
It's the same, and that applies to everything in life,
Yep.
right? I mean, you get out of something what you put into it.
That's also true,
and,
right?
And we're constantly looking for this solution, this like I don't know, this
quick and easy.
Yeah, exactly.
Quick and easy.
The quick and
Microwave.
easy solution to lasting peace and happiness,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
and it just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
It's always
Yeah.
An equal measure for what you're going to get out of it.
Yeah.
I love the idea of burnout in volunteer situations, because volunteers, generally speaking, they're motivated to do it, right?
Yeah.
They say, this is something I want to do
Right.
to get away from the grind, those sorts of things.
Right.
And then I think about maybe the similarities with entrepreneurs,
Yeah.
because entrepreneurship is often different than just regular paid employment,
Right.
because they want to do it, right? They have
Right.
this great idea
Highly
for a new
motivated.
business,
Yep.
highly motivated. They can't wait to spend 20 hours a day at work.
Yeah.
And then even though they want to do it, they could be subject to burnout as well.
For sure.
So what is it about the volunteer things? Like what is it that's causing the burnout? Is it just the difference between is it self-care? Is it resilience? What's happening?
Well, so I think it really depends on the situation, right? So we know there can be multiple causes of burnout, but the symptoms largely, sometimes it really just comes from feeling like you're helpless and it's kind of hopeless, right? So if you end up as a volunteer working in the international humanitarian space, for example, and you feel like nothing you do makes a difference, that will add to your burnout or the symptoms of burnout, right? You have to feel like there's something that's going to happen or a reason, behind what's going on. That's one of the practices of resilience, right? It's people who can say, okay, it's tough right now, but there are better days ahead, right? It's that growth mindset. You also have volunteers who are saying they're taking, in fact, the within the context that I studied, it was volunteers who were taking these teams, and they had a really heavy load placed on them. They were in charge of all the things, the fundraising, the getting volunteers to go on the trip, all the on-the-ground planning, the in-country transportation, dealing with volunteers' emotions, other volunteers' emotions, right? How do you deal with somebody who's seeing extreme poverty for the first time, those types of things. But if we also look on the entrepreneurial space, then it really sometimes it's the demands of not only do you have this great business idea, but you've got paperwork and you've got
Yeah.
regulations and you've got tax stuff and you've got, can I do this stuff by myself without hiring people? Well, that's going to take longer. Do I take out a small business loan? What if,
Right.
I'm not successful? It's all those types of things. And burnout, what burnout really can do is cause us to lose the ability to care. Like we just don't care anymore. We get tired and we get cynical and we get angry. And if you look at any kind of business context or even a volunteer context, right? Who wants to go with a team leader to do a service trip who's angry and doesn't care?
Right.
Right? That's just not that fun.
Yeah.
And it's, it's not that beneficial to people on the ground. And if you have, as a parent, if you lose your ability to care, it's very problematic,
Yeah.
right? Of course,
Yeah.
it's very problematic. But I will say parents of children with disabilities, like they undergo so much extra stress. Their divorce rate is very, very high, much higher than the average. It's even higher in some studies that I saw than parents who lose a child to death. There's just so much stress on the relationship and the family, and there's often no break for these parents, right? And so how do they take care of themselves
Mhm.
when they can't ever have a break? So we had a child with fairly significant medical disabilities. We tried to get some respite care so that my husband and I could go on a date. We could never get it,
Mhm.
right? We just couldn't get it. And there were people who were like, well, I can help watch all your other kids, but I can't watch Elizabeth.
Mhm.
I'm like, yeah, we get it. And she passed away when she was 17, but that's been almost 20 years actually. But it has an impact,
Yeah.
right? So that's part of the conversation.
It's an interesting discussion as well, because on the one hand, like you said, if you use the parenting analogy where you can't really take a break,
Mhm.
and then you look at other situations. I mean, volunteers, I'm sure you could probably take a break. You could just bail on the thing if you wanted to.
Yeah,
Entrepreneurs are feeling like they maybe can't take a break.
right.
Do you have, and in research, I know just having done research is great at defining the problem and describing it very well. But then you're left with, okay, so what's the solution to
Yeah,
this? Have
it's
you
the
found
so what.
have you found solutions as well?
Yeah, it's those deep self-care practices, right? They're rejuvenating. And so one of the things when we talk about burnout and self-care, right, we talk about individual solutions and organizational solutions. So if you're looking within a business context, then you're talking about, okay, do we have mental health days? Do we
Mhm.
have insurance plans that cover mental health therapy? Do we have a massage therapist on site? I mean, those types of things. But a lot of the criticism, I think, against the organizational approach is that it actually has to be part of the core value of the organization.
Yes.
If it's just surface dressing,
Yeah.
right? If the organization says you have mental health days, but it's always frowned on
Right.
if you actually take them, right? There's organizations, even the military, for example, where you say, okay, we want you to have good mental health. But if you're a soldier in the Army and you go to see a therapist, there can be negative social consequences, right? There can even be within the police organization. I have friends who studied that while I was doing my PhD. And they're like, yeah, it's available, but if you take it, your chances of promotion decrease.
Yeah.
So
I had a friend who was with the FAA for 20 years, and same thing. He said that you couldn't talk about this.
Right.
And so oftentimes they would have to even go to doctors that he said, quote unquote, know the score,
right.
and would, so they could say their
Or you
things.
pay out of pocket and you don't charge your insurance, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so you're right. There's, I think it really is incumbent on business owners and business leaders
Yeah.
to either it's fish or cut bait. Okay.
Right.
Either decide that mental health is not important to your organization,
Yeah.
and you're not going to do anything about it, or that it is truly important to your organization and you're
Yeah.
going to put your emotional and financial resources
Yeah.
behind it, to make sure that your employees are taken care of. But this stuff in the middle
Yeah.
just doesn't work very well, where they'll say something because it is politically correct.
Right.
And it's a great thing to put on your on your website how we
Right.
take care of people with their mental health.
Right.
But then your manager looks at you,
Yeah.
out of the side of her eyes because you
That's
want to
right.
take a mental health day. You can't have it both ways that
Right.
way.
That's right.
Okay, so let's talk about this then. In terms of both like paid employment and volunteerism, what can people do to better support their employees in that area?
I think some of it is really recognizing that while people feel burnout individually, it really is a systemic problem. And I think it has broad implications really just across the board. And so creating, like you just mentioned, an organization that's truly supportive of mental health. And that can look like everything from, I mean, potentially training. I'm trying to think of what would not make you roll your eyes, right? But really talking about the practices of deep self-care, talking about the importance of having time to grieve. For example, if there's a loss in the family, right? Instead of expecting you to be back at work next week, you're over it, right? No, right? You're not over it, even if you're back at work. Grieving takes a long time, right? And so being willing to and able to be flexible. I think flexibility is part of it, right? And sometimes it is, can I have flexibility to work from home, for example? So I actually had a daughter pass away while I was a legislator. I was sworn in on a Monday and she died on Thursday, which was awful, right? In fact, as we're recording, it's the date of her death. And she, I knew that I had to at least be physically present at the legislature, and I tried to be mentally engaged as much as I could, which meant I put my grieving on a shelf for while I was there on the Hill. Cried every night, cried every weekend, right? And then went back to work to try and focus on the legislative stuff, and then cried every night, cried every weekend, right? I mean, so there's lots of different ways that we find to process through stuff, but it's a process that takes time. And so the organizational structure, it's everything from the very, very top CEO all the way down to your team manager and your team colleagues, right? People on your team. And part of it is us saying, when people ask you, oh, hey, how are you doing? To say, today's really a struggle.
Right.
It's being honest with that too. And instead of saying, oh, it's fine, everything's fine. Right. But being honest with that too. And if there's things that you need, then asking for those. It's like, look, I need a half a day. I just, this is an anniversary that's important to me and I need to take a break.
A culture that facilitates that would be helpful, right?
Yeah.
Because because ultimately it's going to be incumbent upon the volunteer, the employee, the parent, or whoever, right, to advocate for their own needs.
Right.
No one's just going to know what's going on. You're not going to walk in there and say, "Oh, wow, it looks like you really need a mental health day today."
Right.
I mean, that's unlikely to happen,
Unlikely.
and not even appropriate for that person to be saying that.
Right.
But it's the person who's struggling that should
to also say, to reach out,
to advocate, right?
That's
to advocate for themselves.
Right.
But like you were saying earlier, if the culture is such that such advocation is going to lead to,
it's a tricky dance.
Yeah, like you said, being fired or not being promoted or whatever. Yeah.
But here's what happens, right? So we know that being burnt out has a toll. It has a toll on our ability to produce work, on our work output. It has a toll on our relationships, our interpersonal relationships. There's data from Gallup, a research organization, that shows that the worldwide workforce, there's only 26% of them that are actively engaged in their job. The other, about half, about over 50% actually, are disengaged, and then the rest are hostily disengaged. Like they're actively, I hate this place and I'm going to hurt it on my way out, right? So we already have a workforce that's not that engaged with work. And if we're burnt out, we're not going to be that engaged with work, right? It just is a side effect that's going to come, and it impacts then the bottom line and relationships and all those other things.
Yeah. Well, I think that's maybe the good news for business owners is that, because on the one hand, you could say, well, this is just some altruistic thing. We just need to be loving and concerned about the mental health of our employees. And we should be, I think, just as good stewards of that. But on the very practical side, you can also make the argument that the less engaged they are, the less mentally well they are, the more hostile they are. That is not doing your business any favors, and you're likely operating at much less productivity overall. And so, whatever investment is made to try to improve morale and help people feel empowered in that area is probably going to come back 100-fold, even if you got one less hostile person who actually becomes an engaged person, right? I mean, that could increase that person's productivity dramatically.
Yeah. I think one thing organizationally, too, that you can consider with people who may or may not be experiencing burnout is there something structural that could be changed? Is it really a conflict with the supervisor, or is it somebody who is given responsibility but not authority?
Yeah.
So they're supposed to do something, but they actually don't have the passwords or the keys or the data to actually do what they were assigned. Those things too will lead to frustration and burnout, right? So is there something structurally that way that can be changed? That's important to look at as well.
It's just like you were talking about with the volunteers, right? When they're dealing with these massive problems,
Right.
where they don't feel like they're making any sort of difference.
Right. Exactly.
And that contributes highly to the burnout, which would affect anybody
Yeah.
in a similar situation where they're given a task but feel like they don't have the capacity to do it,
Right.
but yet are expected
Right.
to do it. I mean, what a lose-lose situation,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's hard. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Holly, thank you so much for talking with me today. I appreciate your expertise.
It's my pleasure.
I appreciate the stories you told as well about your family. What what was the original description? Hold on, I got to go back to that.
A large and unique.
Large and unique, yes, a large and unique family. That is 100% accurate, but I would say lovely as
Thank
well.
you.
I would add that to that. Thanks again for being a guest today.
That's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for tuning in. Please join us for future episodes where we will work together to increase our mental health momentum.